What's up, Wizards? It's Dev, aka SBMT Jesus. We like it a magic. I got my powers back. Feels like it's been a while since I had particle effect powers. There they are again. But anyway, I got my powers back because today we get to talk about the deck of my dreams and the stuff of nightmares. Don't worry, it's not another Underworld Dreams deck, as much as I wish it would be. It's actually another Nightmare Shepherd deck, because it turns out there's just no end to the cool stuff you can do with this card. Now, people are already using Freddy to do some pretty broken stuff in this format. By this point, I think everyone's aware of the Nightmare Shepherd plus Gary plus Witch's Oven combo that in some ways forms the late game backbone of one of the most popular decks in the format right now. But a lot of people are doing more esoteric stuff with Nightmare Shepherd too. The other day on Arena, I ran across a deck that was playing Nightmare Shepherd with Prime Speaker Vannifar. They'd sacrifice a Gilded Goose to Vannifar to get a Corridor Monitor, untap Vannifar. Then they'd go get a Hyrax Tower Scout, I believe is the name of it, to untap Vannifar, sacrifice that, go get a Nightmare Shepherd. It's just a really kooky deck, but it's a deck for another time. Today we're going to talk about an equally exciting new proposition, and that is an aggro deck that gets to play board wipes. More after the intro.
Yo, I'm sorting through some heinous haters like a pooper scooper. I'm just trying to take my life like a Koopa Trooper. I'm Double Mario, that mean I'm super. And I'm freaking dangerous like a Chupa Cabre. Got them all day like a Kanye, but I'm way better getting cheddar in Monterey. But Jack, you don't know, man. You got the show, man. You want roast beef? Well, I'm Arby's.
And we're back, but before we get into it, make sure you do all the YouTube stuff. Like the video if you got the time, subscribe if you're new, hit up the Patreon to vote on what decks we do around here in the first place, and check the link in the description if you want to look at this deck list on TCG Player. But let's go ahead and talk about another broken application for Nightmare Shepherd, which is like fast becoming one of my favorite cards. Like if I had a top three, it's like Dream Trawler and then this and then something else. But this is it's definitely in my top three is all I'm saying. I've just been having so much fun messing around with Nightmare Shepherd because it's just such a silly card. And in this case, it allows us to do something that is extremely rare. Again, play sweepers in a deck that also plays a whole bunch of creatures. We've got over 25 creatures in this deck, and yet we're still fairly comfortable playing sweeps in it because of Nightmare Shepherd. And it's a pretty fairly statted thing in and of itself. Just a big fat 4/4 dude flying through the air is actually going to close out the majority of games for us, but it's going to do a lot of broken stuff along the way. In this case, broken stuff means firing off a Shatter the Sky or a Kaya's Wrath while we have a Shepherd out, and preferably a decently sized team of other dudes on the battlefield as well. See, the thing is, most of our creatures in this deck aren't very aggressively costed in terms of power and toughness, so you're not going to be doing a whole bunch of combat damage, save for the first few turns of the game perhaps. At some point, your opponent's going to start mounting a board state of their own, so as long as you have a Nightmare Shepherd out, you really don't mind casting a sweeper and resetting the board, because it's not a true reset. Your opponent doesn't get to keep anything at all, but you get to keep everything in 1/1 token form. That means you get to repeat a bunch of enter the battlefield triggers that can be backbreaking for the opponent, but it also means that you get to be the only one with creatures out. So even if you just have a bunch of 1/1s, you're still attacking for 4 or 5 every turn, and your opponent has to answer it or they'll die. There's also so many reasons to play sweepers in the first place in this format that I actually don't mind playing sweepers in a deck that has a bunch of creatures, even if we don't have a Shepherd out. There are a lot of reasons I want to reset the board. Mono Red is experiencing resurgence right now. Mono Black, very good deck to sweep the board against so they don't get a huge Gary off on you. Also, things like Dream Trawler in your blue-white control deck. Sometimes a sweeper is the only actual answer to those. Same thing with the Selesnya Enchantress deck. If they have an all-seed out, really a sweeper is kind of the only thing you can do because protection doesn't actually protect against sweepers. So again, so many reasons to carry sweepers in this format, and we're carrying 2 of each of these. We're doing a split here for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes you want Shatter the Sky because you'll draw a card off of Nightmare Shepherd, but your opponent won't draw a card. There are other times, however, where your opponent will draw a card and you won't. So it's not always the best card, but it's much easier to get mana-wise than a card like Kaya's Wrath. That said, Wrath is going to benefit us more than it does in a lot of decks that it sees playing because we're actually playing creatures, so we can gain 3, 4, 5 life of Kaya's Wrath, and that's often really relevant. So at this point, building the deck becomes about deciding what creatures we're going to play in the first place and how we're going to fill out our curve. So I'll start here with how I filled out the 2-drop slot, which I think is actually the most important slot in the deck, aside from the 4-drop slot. But in any case, what I ended up on here after a fair amount of experimentation was 4 copies of Yarok's Fenlurker, 4 copies of Burglar Rat, and 4 copies of Charming Prince. Now, it sounds crazy, I know, but I actually think, after playing with this deck a lot now, that Charming Prince is the weakest of these 3 cards. It turns out that the ability for Yark's Finlurker and Burglar Rat to get cards out of our opponent's hand in the early game goes such a long way to setting up our eventual game plan. Getting removal out of their hand, getting counterspells out of their hand to make sure that we can resolve Nightmare Shepherd or Sweeper whenever we want to is just such a huge deal, and I wouldn't trade these 2/2-drops for the world. After a lot of experimentation, it turns out that it's really important not only to get those cards out of our opponent's hand in the early game, but also to get cards out of our opponent's hand when we sweep the board and bring these back as 1/1 tokens. We can make them discard 2 or 3 cards at a time in some occasions, and that can be really, really important for making sure we can close the game out. That said, I'm not saying the Charming Prince is bad or anything. One of my favorite things to do with it is actually repeat one of the Enter the Battlefield triggers on a Finlurker or a Burglar Rat. It's really good at doing that on turn 3, but it can also scry to make sure that we hit our land drops, or in games where we know we're going to need a sweeper. We play this on turn 3 or turn 2, and it can help make sure that we can get to that sweeper in those really heavy aggro matchups where we must sweep the board, whether or not we have a Shepherd out. So Charming Prince does an awful lot for us, and it's even got some creatures higher up on the curve that we get an awful lot of reward for blinking with Charming Prince's 3rd ability. So there's a lot of stuff that Charming Prince does in this deck, but again, it really can't be overstated how good Yark's Finlurker and Burglar Rat right now are. That said, I will do a little aside here before I move on to the 3-drops in the deck, because for a while I was playing Cruel Celebrant, Corpse Knight, and Priest of the Forgotten Gods in this deck, all in different numbers as I was experimenting with it. And honestly, I think I'd just much rather repeat strong Enter the Battlefield triggers like Finlurker and Charming Prince than get a little bit of damage here and there off of cards like Celebrant and Corpse Knight. Corpse Knight or Celebrant never actually closed out a game for me, and again, most of the time how you're going to end up closing the game is with a Nightmare Shepherd flying through the air, or with like 5 or 6 creatures after you've just swept the board and you're getting through for 4 or 5 damage every turn with your 1/1s while your opponent is still rebuilding. That's often how we're going to close the game out, and in the games where I was playing with Celebrant and Corpse Knight, they just never did enough to actually close games out. So in the end, I didn't like these cards, but I do think there is a Priest of the Forgotten Gods deck out there that plays Nightmare Shepherd to really good effect. But now we come to the 3-drops here, and I ended up on 4 copies of Murderous Rider, 3 copies of Plague Crafter, and 2 copies of Kenoros Hound of Athreos. Now, all kinds of reasons I'm playing these cards. Murderous Rider might not be the absolute best card to play with Nightmare Shepherd. Most of the time, you're not going to exile this. You want it to go back into your library, but it's worth noting that you can exile it if, for whatever reason, you want a 1/1 lifelink right then and there, and sometimes you do, so there is that. But in the case of Plague Crafter, this is an incredible card that started off as a 2 of, ended up as a 3 of, because it's just so good with Nightmare Shepherd. You end up sacrificing it to itself, it comes back as a 1/1, you sacrifice it to itself again, and you're really doing a lot of damage to your opponent's board state in that case. And Kenoros, of course, is just a very good boy in this deck in particular, because note that this doesn't actually nerf Nightmare Shepherd in any way. Nightmare Shepherd, and the way it works, completely gets around any of the restrictions that are on Kenoros, and that is really, really nice. But what this does restrict is things that are trying to escape out of graveyards. It also keeps our opponent from getting their Cauldron Familiar back. It's just a really nice card to have in the main deck right now. In the meantime, though, it is a delicious keyword soup that'll often get through for lifelink damage, which we have a fair amount of in this deck, considering we have both this and Murderous Rider and a couple of other ways of gaining life, as we'll see in just a moment. But this is by far not the only lifelink creature in the deck, and sometimes that can make all the difference against the various and sundry aggro decks that are making comebacks in the format right now. Keep your life total up against mono black so you don't get hit by a Gary for the loss out of nowhere, and keeps your life total up against mono red so you don't die on turn 4. Now, speaking of life gain, by the way, we're also playing a couple copies of the Fresh Prince of Belhaunt. Haven't seen this in a deck in a while. I'd forgotten like how good it was. It's just almost always good when you play it. Making them discard a card is awesome. Gaining the 3 life is sweet. Repeating the Enter the Battlefield trigger when you sweep the board, always great. So we really don't have a whole lot of room for too many more 4-drops in this deck, but that's not going to stop me from playing the Fresh Prince. This card is still sweet. But we'll finish off the creatures and the main deck, actually, with 3 copies of Cavalier of Dawn and a copy of Cavalier of Night. I'm only going to play 1 copy of this, but it's worth noting this is yet another lifelink creature. And it is super sweet to repeat this enter the battlefield trigger if you ever do sweep the board. That can be said about both Cavaliers, though. Cavalier of Dawn is really awesome for a couple of specific reasons. The best thing about Cavalier in this deck is that if you have a Cavalier and a Nightmare Shepherd out and you cast a sweeper, well, Cavalier of Dawn dies, and so does Nightmare Shepherd at the same time, which means that you can use Cavalier of Dawn's trigger to get Nightmare Shepherd back immediately and put it in your hand. That is really sweet and definitely worth playing 3 copies of Cavalier of Dawn, but it also takes care of other like problem permanent types that Orzhov has, an issue dealing with otherwise. Things like artifacts especially, but also enchantments because we didn't spend the slots on Mortify or anything in this deck, so it's really important to have something like this that can take out stuff that's not typed creature or planeswalker. Now we're running 25 lands in the deck, 16 black sources, 15 white sources. The only reason for the slight bias towards black is the fact that we're trying to get Yarok's Finlurker on turn 2 in a lot of games. So I want a few more black sources, but really, literally just 1 more black source. It turns out that we're not only playing Kai's Wrath, but we're also playing different Cavaliers, right? We're playing Cavalier of Dawn and Cavalier of Night. So there's going to be some turns where we need 3 black mana on turn 5, and some turns where we need 3 white mana on turn 5. So I want a decent split of both of them. And I do want to point out, by the way, that Castle Locthwain is maybe like the best card in the deck. It's just, it's so good. There's a reason that it went from $2 to $3 to $6. This card shouldn't be $6, but it is right now. And that's because it gives us a card advantage engine where we otherwise just really wouldn't have one. And a card like this or a deck like this, having a card advantage engine like Locthwain, especially with all the incidental life gain that we have, is just kind of broken sometimes. It is. But here's our sideboard, and this is actually a pretty rich and varied and diverse sideboard with a lot of different cards in it. First of all, we'll start off with Dawn of Hope, though. This in long, sloggy kind of games against especially control decks, but even mid-range decks that like to draw the game out, Dawn of Hope can be a really nice card for making sure that we get card advantage, because not only, again, do we have a lot of incidental life gain, but this in and of itself can gain life and be a mana sink, and sometimes that can be important in your Orzhov deck, too. I don't feel like we need to devote a main deck slot to this, but I do want to keep it close at hand, so we'll put a copy in the sideboard. We've also got Devout Decree and Noxious Grasp, just really good sideboard cards against their respective decks that they host right now. Just anything playing these colors, these are awesome against. Another copy of Plague Crafter against cards like Dream Trawler, but more notably, any of the Green, White, or Selesnya Auras decks. This can be great against, so I wanted a 4th copy of Crafter. There's also another Shatter the Sky, just a 5th sweeper for 4 mana for when we go up against aggro decks. There's also Cavalier of Night in there, another card in there against aggro decks for the most part. We can switch out a Cavalier of Dawn and put in a Cavalier of Night. In a lot of situations, that's going to be more beneficial. There's also another copy of Kuneros in the deck to shut down graveyard-centric decks, of which there are a lot in the format, along with 2 copies of Erebos' Intervention, which I've talked about an awful lot lately. I think that more and more we need something that can take out gods, especially out of the sideboard, and this can gain a lot of light back against aggro decks. I just really like this card. But there's also a copy of Heliod's Intervention, which can take out all manner of artifacts and enchantments all at the same time. But it can also gain you a bunch of life, but you'll almost never use it for that purpose. Don't side it in against aggro for that purpose. It's really not good for that. But against decks that play a whole bunch of enchantments, of which there are a few in this format, Heliod's Intervention can be like a 5-for-1. It's just a sick card. Now here are your power rankings. A final score of 66, which is a shockingly good score for a deck that seems so cute on paper, right? I mean, this is a cute idea. Don't get me wrong. I'm fully aware of that. But it turns out that this kind of deck is not only rare, right? A creature-oriented deck that plays a bunch of different dudes that also plays 4 main deck sweepers. That is definitely an oddity throughout Magic history. We don't see a whole lot of that. So as a result, you get a lot of decks that really don't know how to game plan against a deck like this. A lot of control and even mid-range and combo decks will carry sweepers just to get aggro decks off their back. But we kind of don't mind if you sweep us. We really don't care. Thank you, sir. May I have another? We really don't care if you wipe the board against us, because in a lot of ways that can be advantageous for us. And again, it just puts a lot of decks in a really awkward spot, from control decks that play sweepers to aggro decks that don't want to be swept. And of course, again, if you never get a sweeper, you can play a much more sort of linear game with Nightmare Shepherd, where you just go, you know, turn 2, 2-drop, turn 3, 3-drop, turn 4, Nightmare Shepherd. And at that point, you can attack through a lot of what control decks are trying to do, a lot of what even mid-range decks are trying to do, because you're almost guaranteed damage from cards like Nightmare Shepherd. You can swing a little bit more liberally with your creatures, knowing they're going to come back anyway. There's just a lot that Nightmare Shepherd affords you the ability to do that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do. So again, even if you never draw a sweeper, you can play a fairly straight game and still win that way. So again, versatile deck, a lot in the resiliency department, mostly due to Nightmare Shepherd, obviously, so helps out there. But we get to play a lot of really powerful cards without going too high up in terms of cost. The mana base is a little bit much because of the dual lands and all that. Plus, there are some expensive cards in this deck, and it all comes out to about $175, far from budget, but definitely not the $500 juggernauts that we're seeing in this standard environment. Now, I will be playing this deck really soon on camera, but there's a lot to talk about in the coming week here. This deck actually tied with Selesnya Enchantress on the Patreon poll, and I cast the tie-breaking vote for this to do the deck tech today. But I'll be doing gameplay of both this and Selesnya Enchantress in the next couple of days, plus a sort of standard tier list, a preliminary standard tier list this week as well. So lots to do on the channel. Make sure that you're subscribed, hit the bell for notifications, like this video if you enjoyed this deck, especially after you get some reps in with it. I do think you'll like this one. So if you do, come back and like the video. It would mean a lot to me. Put me in more recommended feeds and stuff. But you can also hit up the Patreon if you want to support this content. $1 a month is all I ask. I'll let you vote on what decks you want me to cover in the first place, what decks you want me to play, all that stuff. And yeah, you can also hit up the link in the description and check out the deck list on TCG Player. So do all that stuff. Helps your boy out in a number of ways when you do any of it. When you do any of that stuff, it helps me. So I don't know. Before you hit the lights, just do one of those things. I don't care, but in any case, I guess I'm done for now. Just let me know how you felt about it, what cards you'd play. Do you think the Cruel Celebrant, Corpse Knight strategy, Priest of Forgotten Gods thing is just a better deck? Let me know. I'm all ears. There's all kinds of stuff you could play in this deck. I actually think that like Grey Merchant of Asphodel might have a place in this deck, despite the fact that it's Orzhov. There's a lot of black mana symbols in this deck. So there's just all kinds of ideas. Just let me know how you feel about it down there in the comments section. I will catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.